Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter...
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Patty Hajdu, our MPP from Thunder Bay, Superior North, and also the Minister of Indigenous Services and Fednor. Patty, welcome to the show.
Nice to see you again, Steve.
You too. It's been a while. You know, the pandemic put a big hold on many things, and you've come on the show a number of times before. And I feel like we're kind of tracking your trajectory as a public servant.
It's true.
As shows are put on YouTube, you know, we can go back and kind of go, whoa, well, how is she doing then? And so I want to kind of start out because you've been now our MP, and a minister. Like right away, you get elected, and right away you're a minister in the federal government. You've been women's issues, labor,
Health,
all kinds of things, and we've talked from those different perspectives. Like, what have you picked up along the way as a minister in terms of getting that job done?
Such a good question, and you're right, it's 7.5 years of service as a member of parliament and 7.5 years of service as a cabinet minister in one way or another. And I think back to 2015 when I was elected and appointed, and it was all just so, it was a mad rush, really. I mean, first time member of parliament, getting to know how to be a member of parliament, and there's a huge excitement in especially those first times you sit in the House of Commons. I still sort of feel that every time I go in there, but as a the daughter of a school bus driver and probably not the most likely member of parliament, it always sparked some awe in me to walk into that place, to realize, wow, in our country, regular people can become members of parliament. Isn't that worth protecting, you know? But then also to be a cabinet minister right off the bat, if you barely know how to be a member of parliament, and on top of it, you've given the responsibility of directing a department, or in the case of Status of Women, it was a program when I inherited it. We've made it now its own full-fledged department, gender equality, but... there was a saying in Ottawa in those early days, and it probably still exists, drinking from a fire hose. And such a good description of what it felt like, because just as you thought, oh, I'm kind of getting the hang of this, there'd be this gush of new information and learning the process of how to be an effective minister. Lots of people think that you can control every decision in a department. You can't. You can give direction. You can certainly try to, your job is to navigate the department, to advocate for the department, for the resources it needs, to try to track your mandate that the Prime Minister has given you, and to give the department the tools and the regular ongoing structure to get that work done. But you don't control who works and doesn't work for that department. You don't control necessarily even the speed or the flow of information to constituents. You can certainly add things like more people or different processes, or suggest different processes. Learning all that was very hard and very interesting. But I think over 7.5 years, I've become much better at my job, like anybody. Anytime you do a job for a long period of time, you gain skills in all different areas. And for me, as member of parliament, I think my listening skills have improved. I think my patience has improved. I think my compassion has actually increased because of the diversity of the challenges and the strengths and opportunities that our constituents are faced with every day. And then I think on the minister's side, I certainly have learned how to ask the right questions and pull out the kind of work that we want to see from the departments based on the mandate the Prime Minister has given me.
Well, I remember maybe the first time you were on the show as a new minister, you mentioned you had a lunch date with your deputy minister. And the deputy was so surprised that, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. Do you still do that? Do you still try to build those personal relationships within the bureaucracy? And if you do, why or why not?
Yeah, so it's such a great question. I mean, the previous government, and I hate to be too partisan, but wasn't all that collegial, if you will, with the civil service. And I understand the frustration sometimes. I mean, the department I'm responsible for now, Indigenous Services Canada, has 8,000 employees. When I ask why a process can't be faster, and the answer is we need 100 more employees, you know, that's frustrating to hear as a minister because you think, well, you have 8,000 employees. Is every single one of them in use? Is there not a way that we could take 100 and put them in this other area? So I understand the desire and the tendency to sort of simplify things that we can't see. But what I actually have found in all of my work is that almost every piece of work is relationship driven. You need relationships. And I don't mean, you know, between the government of Canada and a particular community. I mean between people. And the same goes for deputies. They're people too. They have families, they have struggles, they have all sorts of staffing issues and HR issues that I can't even begin to fathom. They've got a reporting structure where they report up to the Privy Council clerk, the clerk that is essentially the bureaucratic equivalent of the Prime Minister in the civil service. And so the more you can actually have a personal relationship with someone, the more you can actually have really honest conversations. And it's those honest, transparent conversations that move balls forward. And I truly think that it's at all levels, our world would be a better place if we could have and inject more honesty and more transparency in how we talk to each other. Now, having said that, in a parliamentary system, a Westminster parliamentary system, sometimes you can't say everything. You know, I can't tell you, for example, what Cabinet talked about last week. And that's because of the nature of confidence in a Cabinet that allows for people to be very transparent and say things that maybe they wouldn't want to say outside, but they feel they have to get off their chest. But nonetheless, I think that in almost every relationship and every piece of work, the more that you can bring your true, authentic, and honest self, the more that you can actually find a place where you can achieve great things. And so relationships with deputies mean that you work through those differences of opinions, you get to know what's on their mind, what they're worried about, both on a personal and a professional level, so that you can be a true colleague.
So you've touched on some real important areas, you know, from my perspective, you know, and that one is kind of that issue of trust, and relationships are really built on trust if you're going to have an ongoing one. I just took part in a webinar last week hosted by the Walrus that talked about trust in government, trust in institutions, in politicians, and in healthcare and business and all kinds of things. And there's a really big trust vacuum for Canadians in their government and in politicians. And, you know, as you talk about being honest, that was really identified is that in the political sphere, there's an awful lot of spin that goes on. And people kind of, at the end, kind of go, I don't know what they said. It just seems like they're just trying to make sure there's, you know, it doesn't affect them. Mm-hmm. In a way, I see your approach is different than that. How does that fit in to, you know, that pressure to always look good as the government?
Yeah. I think it's more than just always look good as a government. I think in the nature of a parliamentary process like ours, where there's an official opposition that has a very important job to do, which is to hold the government account, in a space where media outlets are increasingly facing reductions of staff so that stories can't really be fulsome. You know, in a space where we have social media, where there is misinformation. I was reading an article the other day that had a CBC headline.
I'm going to ask you to hold there for just a second. We got to take a short break. Please stay with us, and we'll be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Patty Hajdu, our MP from Thunder Bay Superior North and Minister of Indigenous Services and Fednor. Mm-hmm. So Patty, we were just talking about that issue of trust and how do you balance your desire to be honest, to have solid relationships with that
The political navigation, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as I was saying just before the break, I mean, there are a number of components that I think are going, my senses, and what I'm hearing from researchers that are contributing to that lack of trust. And we had just started talking about disinformation, and I was saying that I started reading an article the other day that looked like it was from the CBC. But as I started reading it, I just could feel that it didn't feel like a legitimate news article, and indeed it wasn't. It was an article online that had the CBC flagship sort of branding, but it was on another platform that was not the CBC. And that's just one example. There's so much of that out there. And so I think that for me, though, back to the nature of honesty, it's, you know, and I remember this one particular columnist. It was during the pandemic. And of course, there was a lot of heated conversation about what the government was doing and was it right and was it wrong. And all of that's fair game. And for sure, there should be a full analysis. And I hope one day a full pandemic review and some recommendations that will come forward to the country about what to do in a similar circumstance. But I remember this one columnist one time, and it was sort of later stage of my Minister of Health, and he said, you know, the problem with her is she's so uncertain. And I remember thinking to myself, what would you have me do? Would you prefer that I go up in front of the news cameras and say, I absolutely 100% know what's going on right now? We for sure know what's going to happen with the next variant. This for sure was from, you know, this particular perspective or that particular. And I realized that that stemmed from my commitment to not saying to Canadians things that I couldn't verify. You know, even when we took actions that, you know, we hoped would have a better outcome or, you know, prevent more people from getting sick, I would say we are trying this because we are hoping that it will do this. There was so much uncertainty in terms of the first stages of the pandemic. And even now there's uncertainty about to what degree are we experiencing long COVID? What are the effective treatments for long COVID? Are people still, you know, is this less innocuous or more innocuous? Do certain treatments work or do they not work? Do certain preventative mechanisms have a bigger impact or less impact? All of that is very normal, especially in the context of a new virus. And yet the desire of the media at that time was for a minister that would come out and pronounce things, absolutely. And so I had really resisted the urge to do that because I had learned very early on that it was a rapidly shifting environment and that the world, even though we've had previous pandemics, this was the first in 100 years of its size or of its scope, I suppose, and we didn't always know exactly what to do. And so I think that we need room for that uncertainty because the world is a complicated place, and you know that. I mean, oftentimes policy is enacted and bad things come from that policy. And the question can always be, well, did the politicians know that those consequences would happen, or were those consequences unintended? And I think that as politicians, what we owe our constituents are two things. One, our full effort in trying to understand what it is that we're doing here so that we're not voting on legislation that we don't understand or that we haven't been briefed on, so that we fully engage ourselves in the process of creating law or advocating for our constituents. But secondly, that transparency around this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is what I think is going to happen as a result of this new law or as a result of this advocacy that we're doing or this approach that we're advocating for. And an openness to be able to go back and say, if we see that things are changing, we should be willing to change our approach. Like, wouldn't that make sense? It is the same in everything else. I mean, you know, and law is imprecise in its very nature. I mean, law, you know, there are laws on the books that were created 100 years ago that haven't really been updated to reflect the kind of current condition that our world is in. So to me, this is how I've chosen to do this work, and I hope that it, in a small way, will help my constituents here in Thunder Bay Superior North have confidence that even when I have a hard message to deliver, such as I don't share your perspective, that they will be confident that I will deliver that.
Well, as I get older, I have more uncertainty
So
in my
true.
life than as a young person, for sure. And I have to give you some feedback, too, around building that issue of trust. I got 14 grandkids now, and two of them are or three of them are in first year university, but two of them were a couple of years ago in high school when you went to visit. And when I talked to them about politics, they said, we really like Patty Hajdu. You know, she just gave us a straight good, so whatever you're doing, keep doing that, because the more kids we have that say, yeah, I like my politicians, that's a good thing. I want to come back. There's so many things I actually want to talk to you about. We'll never have all the time. But the one is in your ministry now, in Indigenous Services. And one of the issues, you know, I've been keen on for many years is the issue of education on reserve and the funding for that. And for the longest time, there's been a big gap in terms of the funding that goes to students on reserve compared to what we get in our provincial schools, which is not adequate even. Where's that at now? Where are we at in terms of funding for education on reserve?
So, and I'm going to take a guess here, but I believe it was in 2018 we finally did close the funding gap for education on First Nations. And if it was, we'll check back with our fact checkers to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it was 2018. Because you're not the first person nor the only person that has talked about and in fact, I got a bunch of letters from a school just recently in my riding who were advocating for the same thing. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, it's now at provincial comparability. So if a child gets, let's say, I'm going to take a guess, $50 a day, or I'm not even sure what the formula looks like, in a Saskatchewan mainstream school, then a Saskatchewan on reserve school board will also receive that same amount for that student. The argument is whether or not that's actually fair, because in fact, comparability doesn't account for the ongoing discrimination that First Nations children have faced since First Nations were created. By a very colonial government that used actually discriminatory funding as a tool, if you will, to complete the colonial process, or to continue the colonial process is probably a better way to think about it. So many First Nations have also advocated for more than the provincial comparability because there is such an education gap. Some of that work is ongoing through things like our commitment to Jordan's Principle. So for example, now every First Nations child who has an identified a learning gap, health gap, development, speech gap, you name it, is entitled to additional funding through something called Jordan's Principle to help close that gap. But the real promise is these education accords that we're signing across the country with various different education councils. The most recent one that I signed was in Quebec, and a First Nations Education Council now has their own 10-year billion-dollar funding agreement with the federal government and their own control and self-determination around education delivery for about 15 communities. Matawa is now working, or sorry, NAN, Anishinaabe Nation, is working as well on an education accord, and we've got a number of tables set up to talk about the money and what the agreement should look like. That's the way out of this mess, is self-determination.
So we have to take another break. Patty, please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is our MP for Thunder Bay Superior North, Patty Hajdu. So Patty, we were just talking about your role as Minister of Indigenous Services. So what are your priority areas now as Minister?
So my priority areas, and if you look at my mandate online,
it's really long. I just did.
Mandate.
I just really looked at it, and it's really long.
You know, my priorities are really the kinds of mandate items that are going to further that self-determination of First Nations to have control over the way they're organized, their communities run. So the child welfare legislation that my predecessors passed through the House of Commons is a really good example. This is federally enabling legislation that allows for First Nations who wish to take back control over their child and family services can do so with the appropriate level of funding. And we've signed a number of them. We'll probably have another 10 or 12 signing on by the end of this year. I'm going out to BC this weekend to sign yet another one. And each ceremony is really moving because, in fact, communities for so long have lost control of their children, have not had adequate funding to care for their families. And so, of course, all kinds of reasons, but children have disappeared from the community and end up falling through the cracks, and we all know the outcomes. They're terrible. This is part of that transformation. We talked about the education accords on the break, communities having control and the appropriate resources to deliver education that includes culture and language in ways that are connected to the land, or however they define education in their own culture, with the focus on helping their kids succeed. We're working right now on consultations for health legislation, self-determination and health legislation, super important. And it obviously has an intersect with the province, but we have a great example with the First Nations Health Authority in BC, who coordinates healthcare access with the province and the federal government for dozens of BC First Nations, and provides prevention work and services from a culturally competent lens. And then I'm also working on water legislation. As you know, water has been a huge, huge issue, and we've got 30 or so more water advisories that we hope will be lifted in the next year or so. You can follow along online to all the guests that are watching today, all your viewers, and the Government of Canada website. You can see where each boil water advisory is at. Most of them are under construction in one way or another. There are a couple still in the contemplation what to do stage. That the community is doing in terms of how best to proceed, and then there are a few that are waiting for the lift from the chief and council. It's actually the chief and council that determine when a water advisory is lifted, and trust is obviously a big part of their decision about when to do that. But the legislation will provide stronger tools and capacity, including protection over source water, which has been a real irritant, and not just an irritant, actually a tragedy for First Nations that have had water poisoned by the acts of industry, often complicit governments. Tatasquiac is a lake that a community with a lake that I visited last summer, and the lake is completely poisoned. Animals die in the lake, and now Indigenous Services Canada is building a 40-kilometer long pipeline to get water from the less or not contaminated lake down the road. But we've got Grassy Narrows as an Ontario example. So the legislation will hopefully bring to an end the poisoning of water. That really isn't just about the health of First Nations, is it? It's about the health of all of us, your grandchildren that you spoke about.
Well, and this is, something I think that it's really important to kind of see what's happening in First Nations communities with a different lens. I look at resource development, which is a big part of our economy here in this region. And I just feel like the First Nations communities are ahead of us in saying how they want resources to be developed so that it's done in a way that supports their community.
And it can be done. It can be done. As a matter of fact, all the noise about Bill C-69, which was legislation our government introduced and passed in the last mandate, which was a strengthened approach to environmental assessment, so that First Nations had a place cemented in law as part of that work. The Conservatives hated it. They said it was going to create all this uncertainty for industry. And in fact, the opposite is happening. It's creating certainty for industry, because there is a certain process with a very clear role for First Nations. And we have a mine approved in my own riding, Generation Mine, that I hopefully will go and do a signing ceremony in a couple days. It's Bitagong First Nation, or Bitagong actually, and Marathon worked really closely together with the environmental assessors from both Ontario and Canada. Bitagong made sure through a referendum that their community was behind the project. They are satisfied with the terms of the project. They have economic benefit that will come from the project. And it's an example of what can happen if we do this with First Nations people, not with Indigenous people, not to them. Listen, we're in a country we have an embarrassment of riches, and we also have, a shameful blight on how this country was formed and what continues to happen to Indigenous people in this country. And the Prime Minister has put reconciliation at the core. It hasn't always been easy, but his determination is real, and so is mine. And you're absolutely right. You know, reconciliation is not just the right thing to do by Indigenous people, who for a very long time we've, banned any even premise of honoring treaties, etc. But it's about the prosperity and the wellness of all of us, and we have a lot to learn from how we do that in a way that protects the earth, the land, the water, the animals, and really our future generations.
Yeah, so let's shift that around, and it's not like they're getting special treatment. It's like, let's learn from our ability to plan effectively for industry, rather than just saying, come here quick, we'll give you every break we can possibly give you so you locate here in our community. Let's slow down. Let's have those discussions in advance, so that we know that we're going to have something that's going to be good for ourselves, our kids, our grandkids going forward, for sure.
We've got one earth, one water system, really, one environment. The climate change is, as you can see, and I'm sure you think about this all the time in your previous work, and certainly as the grandfather of so many children, it is the clear and present danger. And we are going to have to work collaboratively. And indeed, First Peoples all around the world who are, connected to the land still, have a lot to teach all of us about how we can live, obviously with prosperity, but also with a higher degree of peacefulness. And I think there's some real opportunities here in this work. I would also say that, a long time ago, we made a lot of promises to Indigenous people, and some of them we've lived up to, and many of them we haven't. And but we can do better together as a country. I think when we stay focused on the fact that those promises were not only are they legal promises, but they are actually the promise of a more prosperous future for everyone. So I'm excited about this work. I love it. It's bringing me back to my roots as an activist before I got into politics, and I sort of feel like an activist at the cabinet table as an advocate, really, for Indigenous peoples and for the rights of Indigenous peoples, and I love it. So,
Patty, we need to leave it there. We can do this better by doing it together.
Agreed.
Thanks so much, Patty. And we're going to put on the screen, if people want to get in touch with you, those important coordinates for the website and email. Thank you so much again for joining me today, and look forward to our next discussion.
Fabulous as always. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.